In the summer of 2018, Alex and Marissa Delaney set out to cycle the wild spine of Patagonia, a honeymoon of wind, dust, and endless road. Somewhere between the glacial lakes and the empty steppe, they vanished. No bodies, no bikes, no trace. For 5 years, the case sat in the cold archives, another mystery swallowed by the land. Then a drought bled a hidden canyon dry, revealing the mouth of a cave sealed in stone. What waited inside would not only answer the question of where they had gone, it would raise a far darker question of why. It was the morning of January 9, 2018, when Alex and Marissa Delaney rode their touring bicycles out from the small hostel on the southern edge of El Chaltén, a windswept village in the Argentine province of Santa Cruz that clings to the foot of the Fitzroy Range like a stubborn outpost of civilization. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of snow still clinging to the higher peaks, and the light had that peculiar Patagonian clarity that makes every rock and ridge appear impossibly close. Alex, tall and wiry with a trimmed beard that always seemed 2 days old, adjusted the panniers on his matte black surly long-haul trucker, while Marissa, shorter, with dark hair pulled into a thick braid beneath her helmet, checked the straps on the waterproof bags lashed to the frame of her red Trek 520. They had been together for 8 years, bound not just by marriage but by a shared hunger for landscapes that resisted human intrusion. Their cycling resume was intimidating: Bolivia's Altiplano, Chile's Atacama Desert, Canada's Icefields Parkway in winter, but Patagonia, with its mix of beauty and hostility, had been the dream trip they kept pushing to next year, until Alex's work as a documentary photographer finally allowed him a break. Their planned route was ambitious: 12 days from El Chaltén to Puerto Santa Elena, a route that snaked over gravel passes, skirted glacial rivers, and cut through valleys so seldom traveled they appeared only as faint lines on military survey maps. The first leg would take them over the Paso del Viento, a high, barren stretch notorious for winds that could knock a cyclist sideways in a heartbeat, before dropping them into a maze of valleys where gauchos still rode without saddles and the sky could turn from blue to black in under an hour. Locals at the hostel had given them the usual warnings. Carry more water than you think, never trust the weather, don't ride past dusk. But neither Alex nor Marissa was naive about the risks. They left at 9:20 a.m., the sound of their tires crunching over the compacted gravel echoing briefly before being swallowed by the wide, empty silence of the steppe. At 1:42 p.m., a gas station security camera in the speck of a town called Tres Picos caught them in what would be their last confirmed sighting: Alex at the counter, buying 2 bottles of water and a packet of biscuits, Marissa leaning her bike against the wall outside, glancing toward the horizon as wind teased her braid. The cashier later told police they had asked about the condition of the road to the pass, and when warned of possible landslides, Alex had shrugged and said, "We'll take it slow." From there, the pair pedaled north toward the pass, swallowed by a landscape where there were no more cameras, no more witnesses, just gravel, sky, and wind. When they failed to send their scheduled check-in message by January 13th, families on both continents raised the alarm. By the next morning, search teams were in the air and on the ground, sweeping valleys and river crossings, their progress hampered by gale-force winds and sleet that could sting through a jacket. Helicopters traced the expected route, spotting condors riding thermals but no sign of cyclists. On horseback, gauchos searched narrow trails along the Rio de las Vueltas. Tracking dogs were deployed along the gravel roads, but the scent trails dissolved within meters. Authorities plotted every possible variation of their route, but one problem became clear: Alex and Marissa had a history of deviating from plans, chasing photo opportunities or rumors of hidden valleys, which exponentially expanded the search radius. The absence of any trace, no skid marks, no discarded gear, not even a torn scrap of fabric, left investigators with nothing to build on. Rumors began to trickle through the region. A fisherman claimed to have seen them 2 days later far from their intended path. A truck driver swore they had waved at him from the shoulder near an abandoned mining road. But the leads fizzled, and the longer the search went on without results, the more the wilderness seemed to mock the effort. By February, the operation had been scaled back. In March, the case file was quietly transferred to the Cold Case Archive in Rio Gallegos. Officially, they were Missing, presumed dead. Swallowed whole by Patagonia's vast and merciless silence. Unofficially, for the families, it was as if the couple had simply pedaled over the horizon and into a void, leaving only questions behind. Patagonia has a way of making even the most determined search feel like an exercise in futility, and by the time the official operation for Alex and Marissa passed the 3-week mark, the region's unforgiving geography had already swallowed countless hours, liters of fuel, and the optimism of everyone involved. The steppes stretched in every direction, a pale gold ocean of grass broken only by scattered boulders and the dark silhouettes of guanacos, while to the west the jagged teeth of the Andes rose like a barricade, their flanks streaked with glaciers that fed milky rivers slicing through the land. Helicopters scoured the main valleys, dipping low over river crossings and the scree slopes beneath the Paso del Viento, but the air currents were treacherous. More than once, a pilot had to abort a low pass for fear of being slammed into the cliff face by an invisible gust. Ground teams moved slower still, gauchos on horseback navigating goat tracks that snaked above gorges, carabineros with GPS units tracing every turnoff that could lead to an abandoned estancia or forgotten sheep trail. The map of possible routes ballooned outward with each passing day, because while the Delaunay's had left a written itinerary with friends, their history made it unreliable. In Bolivia, they had once turned a 3-day ride into a week-long detour just to photograph flamingos in a salt pan. In Canada, they had taken an unmarked forestry road because they liked the look of it. That unpredictability meant that even as searchers swept the planned course, there was no telling how far off it the couple might have strayed, or been taken. Theories multiplied. The simplest, and the one most locals clung to, was an accident. A sudden wind gust near the pass could have sent them and their bikes tumbling into one of the countless ravines, their bodies hidden under snow or debris. Others pointed to the rivers. The meltwater streams could swell in minutes after an upstream storm, and the Rio Tunal in particular was known to turn into a churning wall of ice water without warning. But darker possibilities began to seep in. A shepherd claimed to have heard a distant shout near a disused mining road 2 days after the couple vanished. A fisherman swore he had seen 2 cyclists matching their description pedaling toward the remote oil service track that led to the Rio Gallegos basin. The police followed up, sending officers in battered 4x4s along the washboard roads to question anyone they found, oil workers, truckers, itinerant laborers, but nothing stuck. Every witness seemed to be telling a story heard from someone else, and every clue dissolved into rumor. Equipment checks turned up nothing in pawnshops or trading posts. Border crossings showed no record of the couple, though in Patagonia's vastness there were dozens of unmonitored tracks into Chile. After 41 days, the search was officially downgraded. The helicopters were recalled, the dog teams sent home, and the case file thickened only with photocopied maps and lists of false leads. The families pressed for a private search, raising money online to hire independent trackers and mountaineers. But even those efforts faltered as winter closed in, sealing high passes under meters of snow and cutting off remote valleys until spring. Without bodies, without wreckage, there was no closure. Only the haunting absence of any trace at all. For the locals, the Delaunay's became another name added to Patagonia's quiet roll call of the missing, a whispered cautionary tale for trekkers who pushed too far from the main trails. But for the investigators who had walked the terrain, the lack of physical evidence gnawed at them. Even in the most brutal disappearances, the land usually gave something back: a torn strap, a wheel rim, a shoe washed downstream. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the couple had been erased in an instant, removed from the landscape by something faster and more deliberate than weather or misjudgment. In the absence of answers, the file was marked presunto fallecimiento, presumed deceased, and consigned to the cold case archives in Rio Gallegos, where it would gather dust for half a decade before an unexpected drought and a curious spelunker forced it open again. The break in the case didn't come from a detective, a tip line, or a deathbed confession. It came from a hobbyist with a headlamp and a taste for places most people avoid. On February 4, 2023, Ignacio Araya, a wiry 42-year-old mechanic from Rio Turbio who spent his free time mapping unexplored caves, set out alone to explore a canyon in the Patagonian interior that even most locals barely knew by name. The summer had been strange, dry, hot, with almost no rainfall, and Ignacio had heard from a ranch hand that the Rio Blanco, which usually roared through the canyon, had dwindled to a trickle. That was unusual enough to make him pack his caving kit, helmet, climbing rope, headlamp, and a small camera. The canyon walls rose like cathedral buttresses, streaked with mineral stains, and the air was heavy with the smell of warm limestone. Picking his way along the riverbed, Ignacio found himself staring at openings in the rock that were normally hidden behind curtains of water. Some were shallow hollows, but one in particular, narrow, dark, and breathing a faint draft of cool air, drew him in. He switched on his headlamp, ducked inside, and followed a low tunnel that snaked deeper into the hillside. The air grew cooler, the sound of the canyon faded, and after 20 meters he came to an unexpected obstacle. The tunnel ended in what looked like a wall of rock, but the surface wasn't natural. It was smooth, almost plastered, with streaks of calcified sediment running down it. He was about to turn back when his lamp caught a flicker of color, a faded strip of red protruding from a small crack near the base. At first, he thought it was a weathered flag fragment left by some past explorer, but when he touched it, the brittle sediment flaked away under his fingers, exposing something curved and metallic beneath. The shape was unmistakable to anyone who had ever ridden a bike, the top tube of a bicycle frame, its paint dulled but still visible under the dust. Ignacio froze, the hair rising on the back of his neck. Caves sometimes held the remains of lost hikers, but a bicycle this far into one, sealed behind a wall, didn't make sense. He snapped a photo, marked the GPS coordinates on his handheld unit, and began the slow crawl back toward daylight. Once outside, he hiked until his phone caught a signal and called the provincial police in El Caliphate, his voice tight as he described what he'd seen. Within 48 hours, the quiet canyon was swarming with uniformed officers, geologists, and a forensics team, their vehicles baking in the sun while they set up portable floodlights at the cave mouth. Ignacio watched from the shade as the experts examined the sediment wall, their tools tapping and scraping in deliberate rhythm. It became clear quickly that what blocked the tunnel wasn't the result of a natural rockfall. It was man-made, a mix of crushed limestone, river silt, and water that had hardened into a near-impermeable seal. The formation had likely been created intentionally, the way smugglers sometimes closed off illegal storage spaces, but in this case it was in the middle of nowhere, with no road, no mine, and no settlement nearby. The wall had protected whatever was inside for years, keeping out scavengers, weather, and time, until a drought had pulled back the curtain of water and revealed the entrance. Standing there in the dry canyon, Ignacio couldn't shake the thought that he had just stepped into someone else's secret, and that whatever was waiting on the other side of that wall was never meant to be found. The demolition of the sediment wall began at dawn on February 9th, under a sky the color of bleached bone. The forensics team worked slowly, chiseling in deliberate increments to avoid collapsing whatever lay beyond. Each strike echoed dully in the confined tunnel, sending fine dust swirling into the beam of their headlamps. By midday, they had carved a hole large enough for a person to crawl through. A thin draft of cool, stale air rolled out, smelling faintly of rust and something older, more organic. The first officer through was Lieutenant Franco, a wiry man with decades of mountain rescue under his belt. He inched forward on his elbows, his body vanishing into the black, and for a moment the only sound was the scrape of fabric on stone. Then his voice came back, low and tight. "You need to see this." The others followed, one by one, into a chamber roughly the size of a small garage, its ceiling arched and walls slick with mineral sheen. In the beam of a floodlight, two bicycles leaned against the far wall, their frames dulled by a film of dust but unmistakable, a black surly long-haul trucker and a red Trek 520. Their panniers were still attached, straps stiffened with time. Nearby, laid neatly side by side as if sleeping, were two human skeletons. The bones were clean, disarticulated in places where the tendons had long since rotted, but still clothed in scraps of fabric, a torn cycling jersey, the leg of a weatherproof pant. A camera lay on the ground between them, its body caked in mineral dust, lens cap still on. Franco crouched beside the remains, noting with quiet precision that neither skull showed signs of blunt trauma, but both had a thin, dark stain along the collar of what had once been their shirts, as if something had seeped into the fabric before they died. The chamber's floor was oddly tidy, no animal intrusion, no scattered debris, and the sealed wall explained why. Whoever had placed the bodies here had wanted them preserved, or at least hidden, and had gone to considerable trouble to ensure no one stumbled upon them. As the team photographed every angle, a quiet unease settled over the group. The absence of chaos, the careful arrangement, the deliberate sealing, these were not the signatures of an accident. Outside, Ignacio sat on a boulder, watching the officers ferry evidence bags to a folding table. One of them carried the camera out carefully, as though it might still hold the weight of its last moments. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of running water from somewhere upstream, and for a moment the canyon seemed to swallow the hum of voices. The discovery had closed the gap between rumor and reality. Alex and Marissa had been found, but the cave had given up nothing about how they had ended there, or why. The lab work began the moment the evidence reached the Provincial Forensics Unit in Rio Gallegos, with the bicycles, panniers, clothing, and camera catalogued under a separate case number to keep the chain of custody airtight. It was the camera that drew the most immediate attention, a weather-sealed DSLR, surprisingly intact given 5 years in a cave. Technicians dried it in a desiccation chamber for 48 hours before attempting to retrieve its memory card. When the first images flickered onto the monitor, the room went silent. The sequence began innocuously: sunlit photos of open road, snowy ridgelines, a camp stove boiling water beside a river, then shifted to darker frames, the beam of a headlamp in what looked like the very cave where they were found. The last 6 shots were taken in quick succession. Marissa, her face pale in the harsh light, standing beside Alex, who was seated on the ground with one leg drawn up. Behind them, a man in a dark jacket, face half obscured by shadow, stood with his hand gripping a length of rope. The final image was blurred, as if the camera had been knocked or yanked away. Forensic enhancement couldn't clarify the man's face completely, but his build, clothing, and the partially visible tattoo on his forearm were enough to match him to a name: Tomas Recalde, a former oil field contractor known to provincial police for a string of thefts and assaults in remote work camps before vanishing from official records in late 2018. That alone reframed the disappearance, but the pathology reports added more weight. Bone samples from both Alex and Marissa showed traces of barbiturates, strong enough to incapacitate but not instantly lethal. The dark stains at the collars of their clothing tested positive for human blood, though no fractures or blade wounds were present. Instead, there were faint marks on the cervical vertebrae consistent with ligature strangulation. The scene in the cave, the tidy arrangement, the sealed wall, now looked like the work of someone who had both the time and the intent to conceal, and the drought of 2023 had undone years of perfect cover. Investigators traced Recalde's last confirmed whereabouts to a maintenance contract on a remote pumping station less than 80 kilometers from the canyon in January 2018, but after that, his trail evaporated. Whether he had stalked the couple deliberately, encountered them by chance, or lured them to the cave under some pretext was impossible to tell from the physical evidence alone. Theories emerged in the task force meetings. Perhaps the Delaunay's had seen something they weren't meant to while traveling those backcountry tracks: a hidden fuel siphon, an unlicensed mining site, or some illicit trafficking route, and Recalde had decided to remove the problem. Others suggested a robbery gone wrong, though that didn't explain why their expensive bicycles and camera had been left untouched inside the chamber. Weeks turned into months as the case widened, with Interpol bulletins issued and old associates questioned. No one admitted to seeing Recalde in years, though rumors placed him in southern Chile, working on fishing vessels under a false name. In El Caliphate, the return of Alex and Marissa's remains to their families brought a somber end to 5 years of uncertainty, but also a sharper edge to their grief. They had not been lost to the indifference of nature, as they'd once consoled themselves, but to the deliberate hand of another human being. And somewhere in the vast, wind-scoured corridors of Patagonia, that man was still out there, older now, maybe hidden under a new life, maybe watching the news to see if the drought had betrayed him completely. In the police archives, the case file was pulled from the cold storage shelf and placed on an active desk, a fresh red tag clipped to its corner. The cave in the Rio Blanco Canyon had been resealed for safety, its entrance bolted with steel and posted with a weatherproof sign warning of unstable rock, but those who had been inside knew the truth, that the space beyond wasn't just a geological hollow, but a grave shaped by intent, preserved by water, and revealed only because the land itself had shifted. The wind still moved through the canyon, indifferent and constant, carrying with it the unasked question that no report or lab test could answer: what, in those final hours, had been said in that silent chamber before the light was gone and the wall went up?